The island gave Adrian nothing on the first day, except wet black rock, bad footing, and a baby snake that sent him screaming straight into Corvin's arms. It happened so fast that afterward he could not honestly have said whether he saw the thing first or felt it. The shore party had been inching along a narrow shelf beneath a snarl of roots, with a cliff bent inward under the waterfall's constant spray. Whitcomb was ahead, testing the ledge with a soldier's distrust. Inez moved behind him with quiet, blade-clean balance. Diego, who had treated the whole miserable descent as an opportunity to look handsome against danger, was saying something offensively charming about the island's lack of manners when Adrian ducked under the roots. The baby snake dropped on his shoulder. For one suspended instant, it looked like nothing more than a pale, wet cord. Then it moved. Adrian let out a sharp, hysterical cry. The baby snake slid from his shoulder at once, hit the rock, and vanished into the roots in a quick gray slither. His body made its decision before pride could object. He leapt, not away from the snake, straight to Corvin. Corvin caught him on reflex, both arms closing around him so surely that Adrian never touched the ledge again. One instant he had been on the rock, the next he was clean off the ground, held against Corvin's chest like a bride in a scandalous church painting. Then the world caught up. "Put me down," Adrian said at once. Corvin did, though not with the speed Adrian would have chosen. Whitcomb turned away too sharply to disguise the cough that was almost laughter. Diego failed altogether. His grin broke open with helpless delight. "My lord," he said, trying and failing to sound grave, "but that was magnificent."
Inez looked once toward the roots where the snake had vanished. "It was very small." "Yes," Adrian said, brushing damp grit from his coat as if that might restore the shape of his dignity. Corvin's mouth shifted. "Brave work, Mr. Smarty Boots." Adrian shot him a look fit to sour milk. Diego laughed again, quieter now, and the shelf did not improve with any of it. The rock remained slick, the roots treacherous, and the waterfall still crashed a few yards off with that wrong, changing thunder that seemed to hide more than it revealed. That was later. The day itself had begun before dawn with the physician and the pellet. He came with his tray, one shallow cup of water, and the daily black dose that kept Vale's first poison from finishing its work. That was the truth of it, ugly and simple. Vale had dosed Adrian and Corvin once at the beginning of the voyage with something slow, deep, and patient. The black pellet was not the poison itself, but the leash, a stabilizing counterpoison that held the original toxin down for roughly a day, then left the body weak, nauseous, and fouled for the privilege. If they stopped taking it, the deeper poison would wake again and close through the blood. So Adrian still thought of it as poison. He saw no reason to be polite about what a woman forced into his mouth in order to own the next 24 hours of his life. They had spent one night beneath the cliff and waterfall. No one on board had slept well. The basin looked hidden by day. In darkness it had felt shut. When Adrian came above, the light was still thin and colorless. The water lay cold under the anchored ships. The cliff rose in one great wet wall, broken by black seams, hanging growth, and the pale blur of the falls descending from somewhere the eye could not quite master. Men were already moving with ropes, ladders, poles, and tools. Diego had stationed himself beside her with the shameless ease of a man who mistook danger for invitation. "Forgive me," he said, letting his gaze rest on whip, dagger, and then her face. "A beautiful woman armed before breakfast feels indecently persuasive." Inez did not turn her head. "Then persuade yourself to stand farther away." That only pleased him. Then Adrian looked forward and found Corvin at once. No sword,
no irons, no place of command. Yet even stripped of all three, he still looked more like authority than half the armed men around him. Dark coat open at the throat, hard tied back, one hand on the rail, face giving away very little. The pellet had already begun its work. It never struck like a blow. It came meaner than that. A heaviness in the limbs, a sourness in the stomach, the first faint weakness in the hands that made him grip the rail harder than he wanted. A moment later, while one of the guards turned to answer a question from the ropemen, Corvin crossed just near enough to speak without making the exchange public. "You look cursed. I've just swallowed her mercy for the day. Your sympathy dazzles."
"You complain prettily. I complain honestly. There's a difference." Corvin's mouth moved the slightest fraction. "Is there? It tastes vile. My body feels borrowed. And every dawn she proves again that we are hers as long as we keep swallowing." That sharpened him at once. Instead of answering with comfort, Corvin looked past Adrian toward the stern companionway where the physician had gone below. "Does the man carry the pellets loose every time?" Adrian blinked. "What?" "The doses, on the tray or from a case." Adrian stared for a half-breath, then understood. "Loose," he said. "Tray from his room, always before dawn, always with one guard." "Good." The word landed harder than comfort would have. Adrian lowered his voice further. "You think the physician can be turned? I think every system has a softer seam than it once seen." The ship shifted under a small swell. Adrian's fingers tightened on the rail. Corvin saw it at once and stepped in closer, not enough to look intimate, only enough to hide Adrian from Vale's line of sight. His hand came down over Adrian's for one brief second, warm and rough and steady. "Not here," Corvin said quietly. The touch was gone almost before Adrian could answer it. Then, because apparently he enjoyed making things worse, Corvin added, "Easy, Mr. Smarty Boots." Adrian almost laughed, which was unforgivable. From aft, Vale's voice cut across the deck. "Mr. Harrow!"
The moment broke. Corvin stepped back. Adrian turned as though nothing had passed between them but weather. Vale was already issuing the day's commands. At first light, Adrian would call the Wisp again. The climbers were to be readied, surveyors after, antiquaries where footing allowed, divers held for tomorrow if the cliff refused them. Adrian listened because he had to. Then the deck rolled a little harder, and Adrian saw Corvin's hand go to the rail. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone inattentive to call it weakness, but Adrian saw the knuckles pale, saw the brief bow of Corvin's head afterward, like a man forcing something vicious back down. The bastard. He had listened to Adrian complain through all of it and said nothing. Before Adrian could do anything as foolish as go back to him, a low, hollow sound came across the basin. Not from the ship, not from the men, from somewhere behind the white spill of the falls, as if the stone inside the waterfall had spoken once to itself. At first light, Adrian called the Wisp again, and it confirmed what Vale wanted confirmed. The cliff island was the place. That was enough for Vale. She gave the first day to the cliff.
If the phoenix feather lay truly in an abandoned nest, then height, not depth, was the likelier answer. So the rope men went over first, with lines, irons, and hooks. Surveyors followed by boat to mark shelves and approaches. Antiquaries were sent ashore where the rock gave footing. The divers cursed quietly at being made to wait until tomorrow. It was while watching the first climbing lines go taut over the rock that Adrian overheard the age of the expedition. A surveyor beside the chart cask muttered, "No wonder she brought half the world. She's been nursing this ghost since 38. The sailor helping him snorted, "Vale, aye, but the crown's been feeding it since 31. The surveyor looked up. That long? The sailor glanced at the cliff, the ships, the scholars, the foreign specialists, Vale's guards, Corvin under watch, Adrian under use. "Look about you." Adrian did.
Not a voyage, then, a state obsession. By the time the shore party returned empty-handed, the cliff had yielded nothing but more reason to distrust its face. No feather, no nest, no answer. The second day belonged to water, and the water proved no more honest than the rock. Vale sent the divers out at first light, while Whitcomb marked soundings and undercuts from the boats. By noon, the reports had gone sour in the usual ways. Shelves too narrow to matter, hollows that led nowhere, a current beneath the falls that took hold too sharply and shoved a man sideways before he could anchor himself. A line came back frayed, a hook came back bent. Then the death came. One of the younger ropemen had gone down to help secure a line at the basin edge, while the divers worked the undercut there. The footing failed. He fell into black water against the cliff. It should have been survivable. He surfaced once and shouted for the line. Then something moved in the spray beside him. Adrian never saw it whole, only speed, a dark violence under white water, too directed to be driftwood and too fast to be chance. The man's second cry broke in the middle. The line reached him. Men hauled. He came up bloodied at the shoulder and throat, one side torn ragged in a way stone alone did not explain. They got him on board. He did not die at once, which somehow made the deck quieter. The physician's man knelt over him, changed one blood-soaked cloth for another, and at last stopped pretending his hands had any authority over what had happened beneath the falls. The ropeman died before noon. Nobody argued then that the basin was merely difficult. Whitcomb stood over the body with his jaw set hard enough to split shell. Vale looked once at the sailcloth and back to the water, as though the death had clarified rather than changed anything. Again after dinner, she said. 2 more soundings at the seam. That was all. Adrian looked from the covered man to the boats still moving beneath the falls and felt the question in him harden from curiosity into disgust. He found Vale alone for a moment on the quarterdeck and asked, low enough not to flatter her with spectacle, "What does the Crown want here?" Vale did not answer at once. "At heart," she said at last, "what every crown wants whenever rumor refuses to die. Something it cannot afford to leave in other hands. That is worth 10 years. It has already been worth 10 years. And dead men. Kingdoms are built on men dying for things they are not invited to understand." The answer was not satisfying. It was too honest to be empty. By the 3rd day, the expedition looked used up. Vale widened the search anyway. More lines over the cliff, more marked seams tested, more hollow-sounding rock opened where it could be opened. The poison worsened too. By noon, Adrian's hands began the fine, humiliating tremor he hated most. Corvin had gone tighter around the mouth, which told Adrian enough. Ines found Adrian alone at the stern rail while one of the afternoon boats was being hauled in. "You watch him too much," she said. Adrian did not turn. "That would be your profession, not mine. Professionally, I'm telling you to stop making it obvious." He looked at her then. She stood with one hand near the dagger at her belt, face unreadable. "You think I'm obvious? I think you're tired." Her gaze flicked once towards Corvin, further forward under watch. Tired people forget where their face ends. There was no use pretending ignorance with her. "What do you want?" "To know whether he'll break for you." The bluntness of it landed harder than Diego's smile ever did. "And if he would?"
Then Vale needs to know before she stands where the break falls. Adrian turned back to the water. He doesn't take orders well enough for that to narrow the field. That almost moved her mouth. "Better," she said.
She left him with that and nothing softer. Diego arrived later, as if they had arranged shifts between them. He leaned one shoulder against the rail beside Adrian and looked out at the falls with the patient ease of a man who understood the value of underestimating. The silence held until he said, lightly enough to make it worse, "I'm confused, and I suspect much of London is too. You told them Captain Vane forced you night after night. Then you kissed him in the ring. I've seen you with him since, and you are far too easy in his company for a man wronged that way. So which is it, my lord? Did he rape you, or were you forced to confess a lie?" Adrian turned fully then. "You've answered yourself. Captain Vane never forced me. The lie did. And you're clever enough to know whose hands put it in my mouth." That stilled Diego for the first time in days. Not long, just long enough for Adrian to see that the line had landed exactly where it ought to. Then Diego's mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "There you are," he murmured. "That is much more interesting." Vale waited until evening to send for Adrian. She had taken the great cabin for her council room by right of will, if not title. Basin sketches, sounding notes, and marked copies of the cliff face lay spread across the table. Candlelight made everything there look a little more ruthless than daylight had. Vale stood by the stern windows with the cliff beyond her shoulder. For a moment she said nothing. She only looked at Adrian with a concentration that felt less like inspection than old resentment searching for a familiar face and finding it again. "It isn't only the hair," she said at last. Adrian shut the door behind him and stayed where he was. "No," he said, "it's the misfortune of resemblance. You have been punishing my mother through me since London." Something in her face tightened, then smoothed. The eyes, too, that same look of patient judgment, as if the room has failed before anyone in it has spoken. Mina had it at 18 and wore it like innocence. Adrian did not rise to the name. He knew that ground already. Instead, he said, "You look at me as though you are still losing an argument with a dead woman." That landed. Vale's mouth moved by the smallest degree. For a breath, the room held still around them. Basin water knocked softly at the hull outside. Vale turned one glove, finger by finger, against her palm, the gesture too precise to be idle. She was beautiful enough to mistake desire for safety. Men make that mistake too, but women pay dearly for it. "My mother is dead," Adrian said. "You needn't go on speaking of her as though she still owes you an apology." Vale gave a small, cold smile. "No, what she owes me is long beyond collection." That was better. There was blood in that answer. Adrian stepped nearer the table. "Then collect what you came for. You did not send for me to relive old injuries for your amusement." "No," Vale said. "I sent for you because your face makes memory unavoidable, and because memory occasionally proves useful." Her gaze sharpened on him. "You think your mother tragic," she said. "That is the luxury of sons. She was not tragic, she was reckless. She mistook flight for a future and called the mistake courage because it sounded prettier that way." Adrian's expression did not change, but his attention narrowed. "Flight," he repeated. Vale went on as if she hadn't heard the shift. "She wanted the world to arrange itself around feeling. It very seldom does. You speak in riddles when you want to sound superior. No, I speak plainly when you are clever enough to bear it. Call Harrow what you like, Adrian. Without him, your mother would have gone to Scotland with no fortune, no protection, and consequences she was too determined to count." The silence after that was so sudden it felt struck. Adrian did not move at once. Then, very quietly, he said, "That is a very exact ruin." Vale realized it then, not fully, enough. Her eyes flicked to his face and sharpened. Adrian took one step closer. You do not speak like a woman repeating rumor. You speak like a woman who knew what she intended before she did it. Vale's composure held, but only because it had been forged to survive worse. You flatter your insight. Do I? Adrian's voice stayed level. Scotland is not a poet's invention, nor is that other phrase. He let the words sit between them. Consequences she was too determined to count. He watched her hear herself in them. Vale said too evenly, any fool could have guessed the direction. Scotland is where romantics go when they want distance to resemble freedom.
No, Adrian said. A fool could guess north. You gave me Scotland. The candle beside the chart guttered once. Vale reached out and steadied the flame with the curve of her hand, buying herself a heartbeat. When she looked back at him, the coolness had returned, but it was cooler now from effort. Your mother had no head for practical life, she said. Someone had to think for her when she stopped thinking for herself. There it was. Not confession, worse, conviction. Adrian felt the shape of the door opening behind the words and knew better not to force his whole weight against it tonight. So he did what he did best. He cut only where it would keep bleeding. How generous, he said. You speak as if your life had already passed through your hands.
Vale's mouth hardened. Be careful. Why? Because I may begin to wonder who was doing all this thinking for her. Because I may ask who knew where she meant to go. Because I may discover my mother's marriage was not the miracle of rescue you prefer to recite. For the first time that evening, something unguarded crossed her face. Not guilt, never that. Something older, uglier, and far more durable. In this world, rescue rarely arrives in the form the rescued are grateful for. Adrian held her eyes. That sounds like something people say when they want betrayal to look expensive.
Vale's hand hardened on the table. Enough. The room changed around that one movement. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and empty of all but command. Go, she said. If the island means to keep lying, I would like at least one of us rested enough to notice how. Adrian did not move for one beat longer. Then he inclined his head, not in obedience, but in acknowledgement of the wound he had found. As he turned for the door, Vale said, without looking at him, "Do not romanticize your mother's choices, Adrian. She survived because someone did." He paused only long enough to answer. "No," he said, "she survived because someone decided they knew better than she did." Then he left her with the candlelight, the basin charts, and the dangerous fact that she had finally shown him too much. The great cabin smelled of wet wool, lamp oil, river mud, and the sharp medicinal reek of the physician's chest. One man was dead, 5 were injured. The ropemen had stopped swearing because swearing cost more spirit than the basin deserved. Even the scholars had finally lost the look of men expecting discovery to reward them for being present. Vale called them in anyway. Whitcomb came first with the latest sounding notes and a temper set harder than split shell. The engineer followed carrying a board marked with water lines and cliff sketches. The antiquary brought his notes in a state of scholarly injury. Inés and Diego stood where they could hear everything without seeming to crowd the table. Corvin was brought under guard, because by now even Vale accepted that a room full of papers did not outrank a man who knew how bad water lied. Adrian looked down at the spread before them. Shelf sketches, soundings, cliff marks, spray reach, false seams, bird sign. All of it looked like the paperwork of men who'd spent 3 days interrogating the wrong witness. Vale put one hand on the edge of the table. "Well," she said, "either the island is empty or we are stupid. Which answer am I to prefer?"
The antiquary, bent over one of the cliff sketches, said quietly, "I have seen this before." "Have you? Not this place, not this theater." He made a small, irritated gesture towards the windows and the hidden basin beyond. "But years ago, in Wales, there was a priory cellar the wall team searched for 6 days. They sounded stone, broke mortar, lifted flagging, found nothing, because they were searching the wall." Whitcomb said, "And where was the entrance?" "Flood season only," the antiquary said. "Water rose through the lower cut and floated a hidden beam. Until the water rose high enough, the place was simply a wall, and men congratulating themselves for looking at it." No one spoke for a beat. Then the engineer laid his board flat and pointed with his pencil. "The basin wall does the same." He tapped a dark band marked on the right side of the falls. "These watermarks are too high. Not all spray. Some, yes, but not this much and not in that shape. The water has been climbing farther up the rock at certain tides than we've treated as normal." He moved the pencil from one sketch to the next. Once Adrian looked where he was meant to look, the difference became visible at once. A higher gloss on one section of black stone, a line of washed vine bent one way in one drawing and hanging looser in another. Vale said, "Meaning?" He said, "Meaning the falls are not striking a dead face in the same way every time. Something there changes the spread, not below, above." That was when the memory turned in Adrian. Not the Siren Queen chapter, not the stanza, something older, stranger. "It isn't in the Siren chapter," he said. Whitcomb looked up. "Then where?" "The Leviathan." He could see the picture at once, the painted mouth in the water, dark scales, the sea rising over the teeth, while a tiny boat waited just beyond. Mina used to laugh at that story, not because it was funny, because all the sailors in it were fools, except one. The antiquary leaned towards him. "Why?" "Because the clever one waited." Now he heard his mother's voice as clearly as the falls themselves. "Wait until the sea climbs over the bite. That is when the beast is sleeping. That is when the mouth becomes a road." His pulse went hard. "The sailor in the story doesn't go for the mouth when the teeth are bare. He waits until the high tide. Only then does he enter." Corvin, standing at the edge of the lamplight, with that dangerous stillness of his, said, "I." Every head in the room turned towards him. He stepped closer to the table and set one finger not at the waterline, but just below the engineer's higher marks. "If there's a cut behind the right side of the falls, low water leaves the bite exposed. Too much scrape, too much stone, a boat would break its belly going in." His finger moved higher. "At full rise, the water climbs over it, the teeth go under, the sheet spreads different, the vine flattens where the pressure changes." Whitcomb had gone very still, and the opening shows. Briefly, if it's there at all. The whole thing had come together in one ugly instant, too cleanly to ignore. The climbers missed it because they were looking for a cave. The divers missed it because they were looking below. We've all been searching for a fixed place when the place only makes sense at the right condition.
Vale turned to the stern windows. At the next high tide, we watched the right side of the falls. No one argued after that. The meeting broke in the stale silence of exhausted people who had finally understood they had been questioning the wrong face of the island. Vale doubled the watch on the starboard side of the basin and ordered the entry boat readied at first light. The cliff gave them nothing more that night but white water and black refusal. By dawn, the whole expedition had drifted back to the rails, cold and sleepless, to watch the right side of the falls while the tide climbed. At first, it was only rock, vine, and water.
Then the spread began to change. The basin climbed into that narrow breathing place the engineer had marked. The white sheet thinned on the right edge, the black vine curtain plastered flat against the rock, and for 3 hard breaths the dark opening showed itself above the waterline, plain as insult. Once seen, Whitcomb watched it vanish again beneath white water and vine. "Boat," he said. "Aye," said Corvin. No ship could do the work for them now. The opening sat too high, too close under the falls, too meanly approached. A boat could nose in under the right tide. Men could climb the rest. Anything broader would only give the island better wreckage. Vale chose the first entry party at once. Corvin, Adrian, Inez, Diego, 2 men. The 2 men she chose were hers, not Whitcomb's. Vale herself stayed at the control point. The Corsair remained with her, one hand near the curve of his nimcha. The old cloaked man stood to her left, silent and watchful. The boat was lowered.
It took the water badly, catching the basin chop and settling with the slap and sway of something too light for the place it was about to enter. Corvin went down first. Inez followed. Diego came after with more grace than the boat deserved. Then the 2 crewmen. Last, Adrian. The closer they came to the falls, the less the opening resembled salvation. From the ship it had been briefly plain. From the boat it became confusion again. White crash, black rock, dark ropes of vine thrashing and flattening and lifting in turn, and no obvious place any sane man would have aimed a hull. "Keep her there," said Corvin. The boatman pulled. The second crewman braced with the hook. Spray hit them hard across the face. Then the opening showed itself again. The white water thinned, the vine flattened black against the rock, and behind both, the entry pocket appeared above the basin in one brief, clear shape. "There," said Adrian. Corvin did not waste breath answering. "Now." The boat went in. For one sharp instant, Adrian thought the hardest part had already happened. They slid beneath the edge of the falls, and the world changed from open roar to enclosed violence. Daylight broke apart behind them into a smeared white glare through the water and vine. The rock pressed close on both sides, black, wet and polished by years of hidden water. Spray struck Adrian's face cold enough to sting, yet from the dark below the hull came a wrong seam of warmth, as if the cave breathed from some deeper, fevered place. The smell changed, too. No clean salt now, only wet stone, mineral bitterness, stale trapped water, and the faint sour reek of things that had lived too long without sunlight. Even the sound changed. The falls no longer roared, they hammered. Every splash came back from the stone, twisted and too near, until the boat seemed to be rowing into the inside of a throat. The passage bent inward at once.
Corvin went still, not indecisive, listening. "Slow," he said. The boatman obeyed. The channel beyond the opening should have given them calmer water. Instead, the hull shuddered. One of Vale's men swore. "What is that?" "Current," Corvin said. The word should have comforted Adrian. It did not, because this was not the bad water of the basin outside. This was hidden force running under the surface through the dark like something with intent. The warmth came again, stronger now. Diego felt it too. Adrian saw his head turn, all brightness stripped from his face. "That isn't right." "No, it isn't." Then the hidden current took hold properly. It was not one pull, but 2. One seized the surface and sheared the boat sideways toward the wall. The other ran deeper and hotter beneath it, dragging inward into the dark with a force that seemed to come from the cave's own blood. The hull twisted between them. Adrian saw black water leap white ahead of them, then one pale spear of stone rising out of the churn. "Down!" Corvin roared. The boat hit the stalagmite with a sound worse than loud. Wood cracked deep through the hull. The bow kicked up. Inez slammed against one gunwale and caught herself before she went over. One of Vale's men disappeared from Adrian's sight in a burst of black spray. The second crashed into the thwart with a curse cut short by impact. Adrian snatched for anything and found Diego's sleeve, wet wood, then air. Water came in over his boots, black and fast.
The deeper current hit a heartbeat later. The boat rolled. Corvin had one hand on the shattered bow and the other thrown back as if he meant to hold the whole thing together by force. Then the two currents tore the wreck in opposite directions, and the boat came apart around them. Cold water swallowed Adrian whole. He lost the world at once. Up disappeared. Noise became pressure. The current took him by the hips in ease and spun him sideways through splintered wood and rising blackness. He opened his mouth in shock and got cave water for his trouble. Panic hit him so hard it was almost bright. He kicked toward what he thought was light and struck nothing. The deeper current pulled him one way, hot and vicious around his legs, while the upper wash battered him in another. For one terror-split instant, he had no idea where the surface was, only that the cave was enormous and black and wanted him below. Then a shape cut through the water ahead of him. Corvin. Not clear, not near, but there, driving through the current towards him with that same terrible refusal Adrian had seen in him everywhere worth watching. One arm out, body angled hard against the pull, trying to reach him through water that kept wrenching them apart. Adrian reached back on instinct. Their fingers never touched. The deeper current seized Adrian again and tore him sideways. Corvin lunged after him, kicked once, twice, and vanished behind a churn of white-black water and broken wood. Adrian tried to shout and got no air. No, he thought wildly, no. He flung one hand upward, found nothing, then forced himself still enough to remember what terror always tries to erase first.
Do not fight blind. He clamped his mouth shut, stopped wasting movement, looked. There, a pale smear above him, not daylight truly, but thinner dark. He kicked for it. The currents hated that. The upper wash struck him across the face and shoulders. The deeper pool still dragged at his legs, as though some unseen mouth farther in had hooked its teeth into him and would not let go. He thought he saw Corvin again off to his right, fighting the water, turning towards him, trying to come back. Then another length of broken fort slammed between them, and the current took him under once more. His lungs burned. His hand hit rock. He clawed for it, missed, caught a jag of stone slick with algae, and held on with every ragged scrap of strength the poison had left him. The current tried to peel him away. Warm water rushed past his legs. Cold spray water hammered over his shoulders. He dragged his face high enough for one half breath of air that tasted of wet stone, rot, and mineral heat. Corvin! The name tore out of him uselessly and vanished in the hammering dark. Something moved in the water below. Not the man, not driftwood. Something larger, slower. A shape in the hotter black beneath the surface, turning once where no turning current should have been. Then the deeper pull surged again, and Adrian's grip broke. The cavern took him.